Hi, we move into Genesis 17 today as we explore Yahweh's relationship with Abraham's penis. And if that seems perhaps shocking to you, that in a Bible video I would say a word like penis, I would encourage you to go back and watch the previous video where we talked about birth and sex in the chapters from Genesis 16 through 21, of which there's very much. And I won't repeat now what I said there, but if you come in with some kind of squeamishness about bodily sexual parts or about sexuality, don't blame it on the Hebrew Bible, please. Blame it on Christian teachers who misunderstood the Hebrew Bible from the very beginning of Christianity. And again, I won't repeat what I said last time, but if you want to know more about that, watch the previous video, please. So we enter in today to the center of the relationship between Abram, who will soon become Abraham in this scene, and Yahweh around fertility and land, around these promises that God has made. And as you see on the right side of the screen, we've been looking throughout this section in the Abraham-Sarah story cycle to the series invitations, promises, and responses. And what we're hearing in chapter 17 is not new. We were told all the way back in chapter 12 when Yahweh first called Abram and didn't even name him as Yahweh, that people would be blessed through Abram and the blessing would extend to all the families of the earth. And then we already saw in chapter 13, after the separation with Abram and Lot, that Abram's descendants would be greater than the dust of the earth. And so there's nothing new there. But what we're seeing is a repetition in light of the birth of Ishmael. And throughout the drama of this chapter, in addition to the ritual of circumcision and the implications for that, is Abram's, later to be Abraham in this chapter, plaintive cry, what about Ishmael? Because Ishmael is Abraham's son and Isaac's still theoretical, and greatly theoretical, as we'll see in this scene, in the second time that Abram falls on his face. Well, it'll be the first time that Abraham falls on his face. So we'll see that these promises are several of them in this chapter, right here, about numerous descendants and then about land. And we're going to look at how that's parallel to what we saw in chapter 15, but contrary to some older scholars who saw this through the source method that goes back to Wellhausen that we've been looking at, the J, E, D, and P kind of way of seeing multiple stories that are similar as expressions of different sources. More recent scholars have shown very different ways to look at that. And a recent doctoral dissertation from Paul Williamson on that very question denies altogether that the covenant in chapter 17 is a version of the covenant in chapter 15. But it doesn't mean they're not related, as Williamson and others note. So we'll be looking at this momentarily. So as we look at this, we need to situate this chapter both in the larger structure of the Abraham-Sarah story cycle and within its own structure of the chapter, of which there are several options. So let's move into that. We've looked at Joel Rosenberg's structural analysis earlier, but I want to bring it up now because as we see, these two covenants form the G part parallel there. So one way, older way to look at it would be different sources, but a more recent way, only from 1986, not exactly last week, is to see it as two parts of the chiasm. And at the center of this whole chiasm is, surprisingly to many, the expulsion and rescue of Hagar. And then we'll see the Sodom episode and rescue of Lot is parallel to an earlier Sodom episode and rescue of Lot. So that's a way to see it in terms of its literary narrative structure. In terms of chapter 17 itself, we can also see three versions of this. So Wenham, borrowing from others, sees this all as a chiasm up through verse 25, but his critics, including Williamson down here, note this requires a little bit sleight of hand. Yes, these parallels are here, but notice what's going on. In verse 1, it's being divided into four little parts out of just this one verse here. So four pieces of the chiasm only get us up to verse 2 out of 25 verses. What happened to verse 23? It's not there altogether. What happened to verse 18? It's not there altogether. So there's some little elements that need to be nuanced there of whether this really is a chiasm or not. Wenham also offers parallel panels, and I note that he did the same thing with the Tower of Babel story in chapter 11, noting that Genesis 11, 1-9 formed both a chiasm and parallel panels. Here the parallel panels are around what is being directed to Abraham, and then what's being directed to Sarai in the second half. And you can see those parallels for yourself. But Williamson suggests that all of this is a little artificial, and that he sees it as simply three sets of promises and responses that we see there. So I'm sorry, that authorship thing is just a glitch there. I'll take that off before I post it on the webpage. So you see there's three possibilities. We don't have to decide that one of them is correct. The authors of Genesis, we've seen, interweave language in a variety of ways, whether it's chiastically or as panels, or in terms of key words that we'll look at in a minute. So various means both to have the audience keep track of things and also scribes who are copying in the absence of all the material ways we have of doing that, like capitalization, punctuation, spaces, paragraph marks, and all those things, which are none of which are in the original Hebrew, including vowels. So let's look at these two side by side so we can see how they fit chiastically, but also in terms of the themes that we've been looking at. So here's the promise of uncountable descendants, pictured in verse 15, going out at night to count the stars, and here just generally under the language of exceedingly numerous, exceedingly fruitful, and to be multiple nations. And then I want to explore something that different scholars look at differently, and we'll see this more in the next video when we get to this verse. We won't get to this verse today, the other half of 17:6. But back in 15, we saw after the promise of numerous descendants, there was a negative prediction, not a promise, but a prediction. Your offspring shall be aliens in a land not theirs, and to be slaves there, be oppressed for 400 years. And that's, of course, a reference to the Exodus story in the time in Egypt. In our current chapter 17, I will make you exceedingly fruitful and make nations come from you as followed by, and kings shall come from you. And many scholars, including Williamson, see this as sort of a natural progression that the Abrahamic covenant has its fulfillment in the Davidic monarchy. And I'd suggest that's a complete and utter misreading of the story of Genesis through 2 Kings based on two serious errors. One is not discerning which text came first, which is to say that as I've been working with, and as more scholars every day seem to agree, the Genesis story overall is from the exile, but big chunks of the story of David are from the time of David, several centuries earlier. And scholars argue on both sides, on the Genesis side and the David side, but you have to at least have some sense of which came first and which knows which. That's one issue. Theologically, there's another issue, as we've been seeing already, and we'll see more throughout Genesis. If Genesis is a counter story to the Enuma Elish, which is to say it's written in exile to tell the exiles that the Enuma Elish, which presents monarchy and empire as the divine will, is not Yahweh's will, but in fact Yahweh intended for people to live on the earth, and if humans had collaborated, they would have lived in the Garden of Eden. But because humans tried to take control of the fertility of the earth, as we saw in the garden story, God is making it a little more difficult, but didn't change the basic command, which is to say that you're to live on the earth, and that cities are from other people, not from Cain in particular, and that kings are from other people as well. And so I'd like to suggest that when we get to this verse, that this is a criticism parallel to the criticism here in the sense of a prediction of something bad, but that good things will follow afterward. If we read that as Genesis is pointing toward the Davidic monarchy, then I don't see that Genesis has any meaningful purpose at all, except to root the monarchy in the ancient past. But it clearly is anti-city and anti-empire, so we're going to have to explore that question. Then there's a statement of covenant after that, and I want to highlight that the covenant comes in both cases after the statement of something bad that's going to happen. And so on that day, Yahweh made the covenant with Abram, and here I, speaking in the first person voice, shall establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring that we'll look at when we get there. And then the original promise of descendants is connected to a promise of land. Here, this expansive description in chapter 15, and here this more vague but equally could be expansive, the land where you are now an alien, all the land of Canaan. Plainly, this is much greater than the land of Canaan, all the way from Egypt to the river Euphrates, which would include modern-day Iraq and the ancient Babylon and Mesopotamia more broadly, including Assyria. So we'll look at those details as we go. So as we enter into the chapter, I'd also like to look at the key words overall, as we've been seeing in all our Hebrew Bible passages. Authors, Hebrew Bible, often focus their theme by looking at key words, either in subchapters or in whole chapters. The chapters, of course, were added later. So we see it starts with this little prologue here. Abraham was 99 years old, and then we see the covenant played out in these three sections, and each section has a different set of key words. So God starts with, as for me, and we'll note a little bit later, is this Yahweh here and Elohim here? Is that the same? It's El Shaddai here, so we'll have to look at that. But as for me, and then God states God's aspects. Then as for you, what Abraham is to do, and here the issue is offspring after you, the promise of offspring after you. And the response from God to Abraham is to say, every male among you shall be circumcised through all your generations. And we see the emphasis on circumcision throughout this. And then to Sarah, at that point, Sarah, there's not a key word in this section, but echoing the question of nations and kings. And then Abram's response here, which brings up the question of Ishmael. And then there's a response as for Ishmael, who's not part of the covenant, but is part of God's blessing. And then there's the conclusion of Abram carrying it out, and this ritual of repetition here: circumcise the flesh of their foreskins, repeated 3 times, and circumcise there 5 times. So they're carrying it out. So there are a number of theological issues of that, and we'll look at those in detail as we go. So it starts off with when Abram was 99 years old, and Westermann notes part of the genealogical frame with verses 24 and 25, which will repeat that it's 99. He doesn't see it chiastically as Wenham has. And it's been a while since we've seen other people's ages, and that's my note down below. But let's look for a moment at Abram and Abraham age references, because he's one of the few characters where we get some sense of his age over the long course of a story. People like Moses, we get to be told his age. He was 120 when he dies, but we don't get the progressive sense of age along the way. And there's a symmetry to this that I want to draw attention to. So 75 years old when the journey with Yahweh starts, and then 10 years in the land of Canaan, 11 before Ishmael was born, so that our story is now 11 years into the sequence. And now, with just a few verses later, 13 more years have passed without any narration of what happened in that. So from this, we know that Ishmael is now 13 years old, an important point that we'll look at in a little while, and not in this chapter, but in chapter 21. And then we'll see the prediction if he'll be 100 years old if Sarai was to get pregnant, at this point Sarah, and give birth, so it would be the next year. We revert back to in this chapter that he was 99 when he was circumcised, and then in fact the fulfillment, he was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born, and we finally hear the length of his life was 175 years, which is to say there's 75 before, 75 after, and 25 in this journey before Isaac is born. And so that's what we're looking at here. And so Yahweh appeared to Abram, and the word for appeared here is he saw him. In the Septuagint, it uses a Greek verb for like a more of a mystical appearance there, but it doesn't. This is not accompanied by all the special effects that we saw in chapter 15, the dark and the torches and all those things. So just an appearance, and we don't know what kind of appearance that is any more than we did in chapter 12, but it just said Yahweh spoke to Abram and said to him, "I am God Almighty." So the Septuagint has ego eimi here, which is how Yahweh identifies Yahweh's self to Moses in Exodus 3, and is the Greek translation of Yahweh. And that also works in the New Testament when Jesus is identified as ego eimi, especially in the Gospel of John. But in addition to Yahweh being Yahweh in a sense here, is El Shaddai. And this is the first of 48 times for Shaddai in the Hebrew Bible, in the Masoretic text. 31 of those are in Job. And we can see where they are in Genesis. Here they are. This is the first one here, and we see these others. And all except the one in chapter 43 are plainly connected with promises of numerous descendants and fruitfulness. And that's what we see here, as many scholars have noted. So we'll see it again 11 chapters later, and then we'll see it here to address to Jacob, and then we'll even see it in Jacob's mouth addressed to Joseph, quoting or at least paraphrasing El Shaddai there. So translated as God Almighty in the English, Pantocrator in the Septuagint there, but not in this place, curiously. It is in generally that El Shaddai is generally translated Pantocrator, but not in this particular location. And it is interesting, isn't it, that the narrator says it's Yahweh, but the speaking voice is I'm El Shaddai. So as Wenham notes below, it is always used in connection with promises of descendants. Shaddai evokes the idea that God is able to make the barren fertile and to fulfill his promises. Similarly, Green here notes that all appearances in Genesis are linked with the blessing of fertility, supporting the position that connects Shaddai with fertility. But the Septuagint simply has God. I am the God. So the elements that God requires are 2 things: to walk before me and to be blameless. The phrase to walk before me is a standard Hebrew Bible element, whether you're walking with God or walking with somebody else. It's really the Hebrew Bible version of what Christians think of as the question of faith. Faith as a category is not very often in the Hebrew Bible. We saw it in chapter 15 that Abram trusted Yahweh and Yahweh credited to him as righteousness, the famous verse that Paul quotes in Galatians. Um, but the more common way is to say walking, that it's your walk with God. And that's a common phrase these days, but it goes back to the Hebrew Bible long before it was current in our era. So walk before God, and two different viewpoints on what this command is like. First, the older one from Westerman here. God orders Abraham, now representing Israel, which is a leap in itself, but we'll let that go for now, to live his life before God in such a way that every single step is made with reverence to God, and everyday experiences him close at hand. This is not meant to be some sort of lofty demand. It is something quite natural, as Psalm 139 prays in reflection and wonder. But Wenham disagrees strongly and says Westerman is wrong to state that this is not a high demand. When shortly before their deaths, Abraham and Jacob speak of walking before God, they are claiming to have been devout and pious throughout their lives. Further, we can note that Sarna says the phrase suggests a technical term for absolute loyalty to a king. So the demand is absolute loyalty, but is it carried out? Well, we'll have to see. We've already seen that Abram sold out his wife Sarai to Pharaoh in order to save his own life. It's hardly that could be described as blameless. So we'll see what goes from this point forward. The word for blameless here, tamim, echoes Noah in 6:9. It will also echo Jacob in 25:27. Many suggest it could be translated whole or complete. And again, Westerman gets argued with more modern scholars. He had suggested the Hebrew here has, quote, neither moral nor religious echo, but is consciously secular, just to be a complete person. But many disagree, citing that the term tamim has its roots in Leviticus, which has to do with sacrifices being without blemish. Now, whether the authors of Genesis know Leviticus is a question I want to address here, but they may well have. Both texts probably emerged from exile. But whether they know that or not, there's nothing secular in this passage. Certainly, this very verse is all about Yahweh and this covenant with Yahweh. So the New RSV has, I will make my covenant, but the Hebrew is literally, I will give. So it's something given here. Sometimes covenant is connected with the verb karet, meaning to cut a covenant, which is to say, literally to cut the scroll and to have paper to write on or sheet to write on. This has to give, though, to give the covenant here. And it's 13 times in our chapter, as we saw with the keywords. We can put that back up now. Between me and you. In contrast with chapter 15, where it was basically a one-sided promise, as green notes there. So this is the first one that's mutual, and that will make sense out of the response here, and as for you, and as for Sarah, and as for Ishmael, not within the covenant. I will make you exceedingly numerous, and this is continuing doubling as a way of expressing things we've seen elsewhere. Me'od, which is the word for just very or mighty or powerfully. So powerfully doesn't usually go with numerous, so they've translated as exceedingly, but we could just say very, very, and that's one way I have here, greatly, numerous. Using the Hiphil imperfect form of the verb, which otherwise is used as multiply and previously linked with fruitful. And we'll see that elsewhere, which is highlighting the language of blessing is not used here as it was in chapter 12. It's a language of covenant. But both covenant and blessing have as their primary goal fertility. Which is, say, prosperity and fertility of the earth and of human bodies so that people thrive. And so the initial response here is Abram fell on his face, and almost all scholars take this as pious, and Westerman in particular takes this as an expression of submission, but we'll have to ask whether that's 100% true when he falls on his face the second time, and whether he's falling on his face laughing. We'll see one time where he does explicitly fall on his face laughing. So you can interpret that for yourself, whether you think this is pious or this is just absurd that this 99-year-old man is being promised exceedingly numerous children. And fell on his face here, echoing the call in verse 1 to walk before my face. Here, I didn't render that before my face, and so often the New RSV omits body parts, which the Hebrew provides for much more physical intimacy in this relationship than the abstraction of the New RSV. So we'll get to our final verse for today. And as for me, the beginning of Yahweh's part of the commitment here, this is my covenant with you. You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. And the word Haman here for multitude has its primary meaning in sound, from a loud sound or tumult, the roar of a crowd, and then the crowd itself, as the BDB lexicon notes. It's the syllable here that's added to Abram to make him Abraham. So rather than God is my father, now it's father of multitudes. And plural nations. And we'll see how that plays out. We'll look at that more in the next video. But highlighting this is not just the descendants of Israelites, but this is a multiplicity of nations, that he will not just be the the ancestor of the people who are linearly and literally from his loins here, which is, say, the line of Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Sarai, or Jacob and Rachel and Leah, and then Joseph, etc., but of people who marry into them and others who share in the blessing. So we'll see this is presented to an individual and to a couple and to a family, but meant to be universal, as we'll see. So that gets us started. Next time we'll see the issue of the name change and the everlasting nature of this covenant. This covenant is not just between these people, but for all time. And that's where we'll pick it up next time. See you then. Bye-bye.